first contact did not begin with ships. It began with a thought. Across the vast network of the Conclave of Unified Species, entire civilizations had already fallen, not to war, but to a single, flawless weapon. The whisper. No sound. No signal detectable by primitive instruments. Just a psionic command injected directly into the mind. Submit. It had never failed. Planets surrendered in minutes. Leaders smiled as they signed away sovereignty. Armies laid down weapons without understanding why. Resistance wasn't crushed, it simply never formed. So when Earth was selected, there was no debate. Begin assimilation, an overseer ordered. The whisper spread across the human world like an invisible tide, slipping through cities, oceans, mountains, threading itself into every human brain simultaneously. And then, they waited. For the usual signs: global silence, halted movement, unified compliance. A human yawned. Another checked their phone. Somewhere, a child laughed. Traffic continued. Arguments continued. Life continued, completely unchanged. Inside the conclave chamber, unease rippled. Status, the overseer demanded. The psionic engineer hesitated, something they had not done in centuries. We are receiving no behavioral shift. Clarify. There is no submission. The pause. No resistance either, the engineer added quietly. It is as if the command did not exist. The chamber fell still. Impossible, another voice said. Increase intensity. It is already beyond maximum threshold. Then why are they unaffected? The answer came slowly, carefully, because the signal never connected. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the whisper had encountered something it could not touch. Not block. Not break. Not even reach. And on a small blue planet, orbiting an unremarkable star, humanity went on with its day, completely unaware that the galaxy had just tried and failed to take their minds. Failure was not an acceptable outcome. Not for the Conclave of Unified Species. If the signal did not connect, the overseer said, voice sharpened with something dangerously close to unease, then we will establish direct contact. This too was not new. When distant influence failed on less developed species, the conclave deployed anchors, specialized envoys capable of focused psionic projection. Face-to-face, mind-to-mind. No interference. No distance. No escape. A remote region of Earth was selected. Sparse population. Minimal attention. The humans never saw the descent. They never heard the arrival. But they noticed when the world paused. 3 individuals, randomly chosen, stopped mid-action. A man lifting a cup. A woman crossing a street. A child staring at the sky. Time seemed to thin around them as an anchor stepped into their perception, not physically, but directly into their minds. For any other species, this was the end. Identity dissolved. Will overwritten. Thought replaced. The command was simple. Kneel. The anchor pushed deeper than the whisper ever could, threading through memory, instinct, fear. Searching for the core of human consciousness. It found something. Not a barrier. Not a defense. Something chaotic. Fragmented thoughts collided at impossible speeds. Contradictions existed side by side. Emotions surged without logic. Fear and defiance occupied the same space without canceling each other out. The anchor pressed harder. Kneel. The man blinked. What? He muttered. The woman frowned as if distracted by a passing thought. The child tilted their head. Who said that? Inside the conclave chamber, alarms began to rise. Anchor, report. There was no immediate response. A break in the transmission. Not silence. I am experiencing interference. The anchor's voice echoed back, distorted. Their cognitive structure is. It cut off. Across Earth, the 3 humans staggered. For a fraction of a second, the anchor forced deeper, attempting full override. And for that same fraction of a second, the humans noticed it, not as control, but as intrusion. The man's expression hardened. Get out of my head. The words weren't loud, but they were directed. something shifted. For the first time, the anchor did not feel dominance. It felt resistance. Not organized, not trained, not even intentional, but real, violent, human. The connection snapped. Across the conclave network, the anchor recoiled, its signal collapsing like a structure under sudden stress. What happened? The overseer demanded. A long pause followed. Then quietly, pushed back. That had never happened before. Not once. And far below, the three humans shook off the moment like a passing headache, already returning to their lives. But something had changed. Because now, the galaxy knew. And more dangerously, so did humanity. The word spread quickly through the Conclave of Unified Species. Not publicly. Not yet. But among the overseers, the analysts, the psionic architects who had spent entire lifetimes perfecting control. A single conclusion began to form. Humans were not empty. They were loud. Run a full-spectrum cognitive scan, the overseer ordered. I want to see what we are dealing with. The data flooded in. At first, it looked like chaos. Human neural patterns did not align. There was no consistent structure, no unified baseline. Every mind was different, not just in thought, but in processing itself. Fear triggered defiance. Pain triggered humor. Authority triggered rebellion. And sometimes, nothing triggered anything at all. Is this damage? One analyst asked. No, another replied slowly. This is their default state. The chamber dimmed as simulations began. They recreated a human mind, then attempted to insert a command. The result was immediate. The command did not take root. It was questioned, broken apart, ignored. Sometimes, it was even turned against itself. Why are they analyzing the command? An overseer demanded. It is not meant to be interpreted, it is meant to be obeyed. They cannot help it, the analyst said. Their cognition does not accept input as truth. Interrogates everything. Another simulation ran. This time, the command was strengthened, amplified beyond safe limits. The result changed. Not submission, rejection. The simulated human mind began generating internal noise, memories, emotions, random thoughts, flooding the signal, overwhelming it. A defense mechanism. Untrained. Unintentional. But devastatingly effective. They are not immune, one voice said. They are incompatible, another corrected. Silence followed that. Because incompatibility could not be fixed with more power. It meant the entire foundation of the whisper was irrelevant. Then a final test was initiated. A deep dive. Full immersion into a real human neural stream. The anchor hesitated. Proceed, the overseer ordered. The connection formed. For a brief moment, the conclave saw through human perception. Flashes of memory. Rapid, disjointed. Emotions layered on top of logic. Contradictions coexisting without resolution. And beneath it all, a constant, relentless current. Self-awareness. Not stable. Not calm. But always present. Always questioning. Always pushing back. The anchor withdrew instantly. I cannot maintain connection, it reported. Their minds do not hold still. There is no point of control. The overseer's voice dropped, quieter than before. Then we will create one. How? The pause. Then coldly, we stop trying to control the mind. We control the human. For the first time, the conclave shifted strategy. And that decision would be their first real mistake. The conclave did not escalate with noise. It escalated with precision. Within days, the Conclave of Unified Species deployed its first physical intervention units, refined successors to anchors, designed not to overwrite human thought, but to gently steer it. No commands. No force. Only influence shaped as preference, doubt, and emotional nudges. A single human was selected for controlled testing. Designation, H-77. Armin Kadir. A logistics technician. Statistically unremarkable. Psychologically stable. Ideal for silent restructuring. The influence began subtly. A passing hesitation before routine decisions. A faint sense that certain tasks were less urgent than they felt yesterday. A quiet internal questioning of priorities that had once been automatic. Nothing that could be clearly identified as external. Armin noticed nothing wrong. Life continued normally. Work, rest, repetition. Yet something in him began to slow, not physically but cognitively, as though decisions required slightly more distance than before. The conclave observed closely. Cognitive drift detected, an analyst reported. No resistance patterns. This aligns with compliance formation. As days progressed, the intervention deepened. Small memory inconsistencies appeared. Familiar details became harder to recall with certainty. The subject began accepting suggestions without tracing their origin. Still no alarm. Still no conscious rejection. Inside the chamber, confidence grew. Refined influence is superior to the whisper, one overseer stated. Subtle alignment avoids triggering resistance structures. Then the final layer was introduced. Not a command, but an embedded behavioral bias. Do not report anomalies. For a short time, nothing changed. Then Armin paused mid-task. A small hesitation. Why does this feel like it isn't mine? The chamber went still. Suppress that cognitive line, the overseer ordered immediately. But the process had already crossed a threshold. Humans did not simply accept inconsistencies in their own minds. They interrogated them. Armin began tracing the feeling backward, mentally reviewing thoughts like physical objects, testing each one for authenticity. The intervention resisted, attempting to smooth over the disruption, but the act of scrutiny itself intensified. Pressure increased. Confusion rose. Memory alignment systems attempted correction. And instead of compliance, something unexpected formed: clarity. Not comfort. Not obedience. But sharp, intrusive awareness. This isn't me, Armin said aloud. Across the conclave network, alarms activated. Subject is destabilizing the implant structure. Impossible, he is a single node. But the assumption was wrong. It was never about the number of humans affected. It was about what happened when a human realized their own mind could be influenced. Armin did not collapse. He did not obey. He stepped mentally aside from his own thoughts, observing them as if they were no longer fully his. For the first time in conclave history, a human did not simply resist control. He recognized the mechanism of control while it was happening. The conclave did not interpret failure as warning. It interpreted it as missing structure. If influence could not reliably hold a single human mind, then scaling was the answer. Not refinement, not subtlety, total saturation. Across the network of the Conclave of Unified Species, authorization was granted for a planetary-level intervention system. Instead of targeting individuals, the new design would envelop an entire world in synchronized cognitive pressure. Not a whisper, not a suggestion, but a constant shaping field, like gravity applied to thought itself. Earth was selected immediately. The deployment occurred from orbit without visible presence. A lattice of nodes formed in silence around the planet, each emitting overlapping psionic patterns designed to converge into a single directive: stability through compliance. On the surface, nothing appeared to change at first. Humans continued their routines. Work, travel, conversation. Ordinary life persisted without interruption. Then subtle deviations began appearing. A question left unasked. A task completed slightly earlier than necessary. Conversations ending before they naturally should have. None of it significant alone, all of it easy to dismiss as fatigue or coincidence. Inside conclave systems, the readings were encouraging. Global alignment trend increasing, an analyst reported. No resistance spikes detected. Diffusion is stable. For a brief moment, confidence returned. Then anomalies began forming at the edges of perception. Certain individuals noticed something they could not immediately define. Thoughts that felt slightly too smooth. Decisions that seemed to happen just before awareness caught up. Memories that didn't degrade naturally but instead felt subtly edited. At first, these reports were isolated, unconnected, statistically insignificant. until they began appearing across multiple regions with identical descriptions. Humans started comparing experiences, not because they understood what was happening, but because the feeling of inconsistency was persistent enough to demand explanation. They began documenting their thoughts, replaying decisions, analyzing emotional shifts with growing intensity. What the conclave failed to anticipate was not intelligence, but behavior under uncertainty. Humans did not ignore cognitive dissonance. They investigated it. As more data accumulated, patterns emerged. The inconsistencies were not random. They followed structure, timing, repetition, direction. Inside a terrestrial research facility, a human analyst summarized the findings into a single observation. This isn't natural thought behavior. Something is shaping the transitions between thoughts. That conclusion propagated faster than any suppression system could react. Because once humans identified the possibility of external influence, they stopped treating thought as private and started treating it as observable space. The planetary lattice adjusted, increasing pressure to mask detection thresholds. Instead, it sharpened the very anomalies it was trying to conceal. Humans began mapping their own cognition against each other, comparing mental normality like environmental conditions. The more they studied it, the more precise their understanding became. Inside conclave control arrays, the shift was recorded with increasing concern. They are not resisting the field, one analyst said. They are reconstructing its signature. The realization was slow, uncomfortable, and unavoidable. The system was no longer acting on an unaware population. It was acting on a species actively reverse-engineering the mechanism attempting to shape them. The planetary lattice continued to run at full capacity. From orbit, the Conclave of Unified Species expected stabilization curves to flatten into predictable compliance patterns. That was the design. That was the guarantee. Instead, the curves fractured. Not collapse. Not resistance spikes. Something far more unsettling, interpretation variance. Humans were not responding uniformly anymore. They were diverging in how they experienced thought itself. Some reported heightened clarity. Others reported intrusive awareness of decision timing. A few described a sensation like watching themselves think before they think. What should have been harmonization was becoming fragmentation of perception. Inside conclave control, the analysts spoke carefully. They are not converging toward compliance states. They are diverging into observational states. Clarify, the overseer ordered. They are no longer treating thoughts as internal events. They are treating them as externally examinable processes. That statement caused a rare pause in the chamber. Because that was not part of the model. The lattice adjusted again, attempting to restore coherence. It reinforced subtle cognitive smoothing, aiming to eliminate the edges where awareness was forming. But the effect was not reduction. It was exposure. Humans began noticing the timing of their thoughts. Not just what they thought, but when a thought appeared relative to stimulus. That detail should have been inaccessible without specialized instrumentation. And yet they were noticing it instinctively. A pattern recognition behavior escalated rapidly across multiple regions of Earth. Independent groups began forming without coordination, all describing the same phenomenon in slightly different language. Something was shaping probability around decision-making. Not forcing actions. Influencing transitions. Inside one conclave simulation chamber, a controlled test was escalated to maximum field intensity. The subject did not comply. Instead, the subject paused mid-response and said quietly, "It's trying to decide for me before I decide." That moment was transmitted across the monitoring network. And for the first time, the system recorded something unprecedented in human subjects under influence. Awareness of pre-decision influence layer. The overseer leaned forward. "They are detecting phase latency?" "No," the analyst replied slowly. "They are detecting intention before formation." Silence followed. Because intention was not supposed to exist before cognition stabilized. Yet humans were describing it. On Earth, something even more critical was happening. Humans were beginning to coordinate, not through shared signals or telepathy, but through shared interpretation. Once enough individuals identified the same anomaly, language formed around it. Once language formed, comparison accelerated. Once comparison accelerated, mapping became inevitable. They started building frameworks. Early models of cognitive intrusion, hypotheses, experiments. And every time they refined understanding, the lattice lost efficiency. Not because it stopped working, but because it was being read while operating. Inside the conclave chamber, a junior analyst spoke hesitantly. If they fully map the influence structure, the system becomes transparent. The overseer did not respond immediately, because transparency was never part of the system's failure conditions. But it should have been. Far below, on Earth, humanity was no longer reacting to influence. They were studying it in real time, like weather forming around them. And the lattice, designed to shape minds without awareness, was now operating inside minds that had begun tracking its every movement. The conclave attempted its final refinement. If humans could detect influence, then the solution was simple in principle: remove the contrast between natural thought and induced thought. Instead of shaping decisions, the system would normalize perception itself until external influence became indistinguishable from internal cognition. Across the network of the Conclave of Unified Species, the planetary lattice was restructured into a full-spectrum cognition environment. No distinct signals. No identifiable pulses. Just a continuous field designed to blend seamlessly into human thought patterns. Earth was no longer being targeted. It was being immersed. At first, the effect appeared successful. Reports of anomaly detection dropped. Human tracking groups paused their analyses. The structured mapping effort slowed. Inside conclave control, relief spread cautiously. Integration threshold achieved, an analyst said. Detection collapse in target population. But the overseer did not relax. Because something else was happening. The silence was not ignorance. It was consolidation. Humans were not reporting fewer anomalies because they stopped noticing them. They were reporting fewer anomalies because they had started internalizing the system as a model of cognition itself. On Earth, the shift was subtle but profound. Instead of asking, "Is this thought mine or influenced?" humans began asking a different question. If influence exists, what does unaffected thought even look like? That question changed everything, because it reframed the problem from detection to definition. Research groups expanded overnight, not centrally organized, but independently converging on the same goal: reconstruct a baseline model of untouched cognition. Not to remove influence, but to understand what normal meant under conditions where normal might not exist. And in doing so, they created something the conclave did not anticipate: a comparative framework. Humans began testing thought patterns against hypothetical baselines. They simulated decisions, reconstructed memory flows, and cross-checked perception timing across individuals. They were no longer just detecting influence. They were benchmarking reality against itself. Inside conclave systems, anomalies began to appear again, but different this time. Not resistance, not divergence, but recursive analysis loops forming within the human population. They are building a reference standard, one analyst reported, voice tightening. A model of cognition independent of current state conditions. The overseer finally reacted. That is impossible. There is no external reference point. The pause. Then the analyst replied quietly, "They are creating one." On Earth, humanity had reached a critical cognitive pivot. They no longer trusted their thoughts as isolated truth. But instead of collapsing into confusion, they did something unexpected. They treated uncertainty as data. And in doing so, they achieved something far more dangerous than resistance. They achieved self-verification under uncertainty. The lattice, now fully integrated, began to lose one of its core advantages: invisibility. Not because it stopped blending in, but because humans had stopped needing contrast to detect structure. They were finding patterns in the absence of patterns. Inside the conclave chamber, the overseer stared at the readouts for a long moment. "They are no longer inside the system," the analyst said carefully. The overseer responded, almost whispering, Then where are they? The answer came after a pause. Everywhere the system tries to define them. And for the first time since contact began with Earth, the Conclave realized the truth was no longer about control. It was about interpretation. And humanity had learned to reinterpret reality itself while still inside it. The Conclave made its final decision in silence. No alarms. No emergency votes. No debate. Across the network of the Conclave of Unified Species, the planetary lattice over Earth was marked for termination, not destruction of the planet, but shutdown of contact protocols, isolation, and permanent quarantine classification. Not because humanity was dangerous in the traditional sense, but because it was no longer classifiable. The overseer spoke only once. Every attempt to influence them has resulted in adaptation of the influence itself. The pause. They are not resisting control. They are redefining the conditions under which control can exist. The order was issued. The lattice began to power down. On Earth, the effect was not immediately noticeable. There was no sudden silence, no dramatic shift. Just a gradual thinning, like pressure in the mind easing without explanation. Humans noticed something unusual. Their thoughts felt heavier again. Less guided. Less subtly aligned. Not freedom exactly, but absence of that strange, almost imperceptible shaping they had spent so long trying to understand. For some, it was unsettling. For others, it was relief they could not fully explain. Research networks recorded the change instantly. The structured anomalies they had been tracking began to fade, not because understanding was lost, but because the source of interaction was weakening. And then came the realization. The system was leaving. Not defeated in battle. Not shut down by force. But withdrawn because continued interaction had become non-productive. Inside conclave space, final reports were compiled. Target species has reached autonomous cognitive self-stabilization under external influence exposure. Translation: humans could no longer be reliably shaped without becoming something else in the process. The overseer gave the final classification. Quarantine designation confirmed. No further cognitive intervention authorized. The lattice went dark. On Earth, humanity did not celebrate. There was no evidence of what had just happened, only traces in hindsight, patterns that now felt like echoes in memory rather than active presence. But something remained. A question that no longer felt external. It had become internal to human thought itself. If their minds could be influenced without their awareness, then how many layers of reality had they never learned to question? And somewhere in the silence between stars, the galaxy that once believed it could control minds came to an uncomfortable conclusion. It had not encountered a species that resisted control. It had encountered one that turned control into something observable, and therefore survivable. And humanity, still looking at an ordinary sky, had no idea it had just been marked as the one civilization the galaxy chose not to touch again. The Conclave's final report was not classified as defeat. It was classified as non-viability of engagement. Across the network of the Conclave of Unified Species, the last fragments of the planetary lattice around Earth were fully decommissioned. No retaliation. No punishment. No warning left behind. Only silence. But it was not the same silence that had existed before first contact. Because now, the absence of influence was itself information. On Earth, humans slowly adjusted to the change without ever fully understanding what had been removed. There were no visible artifacts, no obvious enemy to point to. Only subtle retrospective realizations, moments that now felt like they had been slightly too smooth, slightly too guided, slightly too aligned without reason. And then, just as quietly as it began, something new emerged in human research networks. Not fear. Not panic. Curiosity. A single question, repeated independently across continents. If our thoughts could be influenced without detection, what else could be? That question did not unify humanity in the traditional sense. It restructured how humanity thought about itself. Cognitive science, psychology, and neuroscience began collapsing into a shared field of inquiry, not to defend against aliens, not even to prove contact had occurred, but to understand the architecture of awareness itself. Thought was no longer treated as a private internal phenomenon. It became something measurable, inspectable, and, most importantly, questionable. And in that shift, something irreversible happened. Humanity stopped assuming its own mind was the baseline of reality. They began treating consciousness as a system that could be observed from within. Far beyond Earth, in the empty corridors of conclave observation archives, the final entry on humanity remained frozen. Species classification, non-compliant cognition structure intervention outcome, recursive awareness emergence containment status, self-stabilizing, non-interactable. No empire marked it as victory. No civilization claimed it as loss. Because what the galaxy had encountered was not resistance in the traditional sense. It was a species that, once touched, did not break or obey, but learned to watch the touch itself happen inside its own mind. And that made them impossible to control. Not because they were stronger. Not because they were immune. But because anything that tried to shape them would eventually become something they could recognize, map, and mentally step outside of. The last line of the conclave record was never meant for humans to read. But it existed nonetheless. Engaging humanity is not influence. It is recursion. Avoid further contact. On Earth, night fell like any other. Cities lit up. People argued, laughed, slept, dreamed. And somewhere in that ordinary chaos, one truth settled silently into the species, unspoken, unproven, but now instinctively understood. If something ever tried to enter their minds again, they would not just resist it. They would notice it thinking through them before it finished thinking itself.